The Andy Poland Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, thinking they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Poland Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
There are stories involving games that are going on right now. The Stanley Cup Finals, surprisingly, have been extended to a Game 6. Nationals were cooled off last night by Arizona. The Orioles lost the opening of a huge series against the Yankees last night. But it's not the games that we're talking about today. And especially people my age are walking around talking about the greatest player we ever saw, those of us who were lucky enough to have seen him play, and maybe the greatest player in the history of baseball, and arguably the greatest American athlete of all time. Now, that discussion takes you to people like Michael Jordan, Jim Brown, Jerry Rice, Tom Brady, although Tom Brady is not really athletic. He's the greatest winner of all time in the NFL. But I come from a time, and it's hard to imagine this, but in my youth, when I was preteen, the athlete that we talked about was a baseball player. His name was Willie Mays. And kids today, they dream about becoming LeBron James, or they heard from their dad about Michael Jordan. But in my era, and he was still active when I was a kid, right up until I was, I think, 15 years old, it was Willie Mays. And baseball, again, hard to imagine this when the Super Bowl is drawing 100 million viewers and the World Series is averaging 9 million viewers. But when I was a kid, baseball was the number one sport, way ahead of football. It wasn't really until the 1980s, maybe even the late 1980s, that football fully overtook baseball. And we look forward to the World Series. And on top of that, we look forward to seeing Willie Mays, which was a rare treat. We didn't have games on all the time. There wasn't an MLB network. And if you lived in an American League city like I did, Washington, we never saw him play here. The only thing you got to see was maybe the Saturday game of the week on NBC. And they would, I guess, try to feature him as much as possible. Although, Giants being a West Coast team, I think the game would come on at 2 o'clock. So if the Giants were playing a 1 o'clock game on a Saturday afternoon, it's too late for that, and you'd have to have them start at 11. So it was rare, really, to see even Willie Mays on television. And to get the opportunity to see him in person, it was, something if you lived like in a city like Philadelphia or New York, you'd wait for the opportunity when the Giants would come there. But other than that, it was a lot of just people talking about him, people saying what they had seen. Now, nowadays, you see viral videos on your phone instantly. We didn't have viral videos. We didn't have the internet. But I knew about the catch when I was a kid, because when they would do feature stories on Willie Mays, and they weren't that common. There weren't as many, news shows that were going on. But somewhere along the line, I had seen the film of the catch. And, when you think about all sports, how many sports have a signature defensive play? There's, in football, the Dwight Clark catch from Joe Montana in the NFC Championship game. Great plays in Super Bowls, the Lynn Swann catches, things like that. It's rare when you talk about a defensive play. The greatest defensive play in Washington football team history was the play at the goal line where Walt Garrison was stopped by Kenny Houston. Kenny Houston wrestling a man who, ironically, wrestled bulls. That's what he did in the offseason. He was a rodeo guy, Walt Garrison, and just like Garrison was bringing down bulls, Ken Houston brought down this big bull fullback and preserved a 14-7 win on Monday Night Football against the Cowboys. That's the signature defensive play in this town. Willie Mays had the signature defensive play in the history of baseball. And it happened in the 1954 World Series where, by the way, when we now refer to athletes by how many rings they have won, Willie Mays won one. He won one in the 1954 World Series because when he played, that era was dominated by the Yankees. The Yankees won almost every year, including, I think, 5 in a row during the 1950s. So he was up against that all the time. But in 1954, they made it against the Cleveland Indians, who I believe set a record that year with 110 wins, maybe even 114 wins in a 154-game schedule. It was remarkable. And this was game 1 of the World Series at the Polo Grounds. And, stadiums are basically configured the same now. There might be a little bit of difference in how far the left field wall is, right field, same thing. But in those days, the Polo Grounds was built for things other than baseball. So dead center field, you're talking about close to 500 feet. So you get a poke out there, you got to be talking about a mammoth blast. Vic Wertz is at the plate in game 1. It's a 2-2 game. And Wertz hits a ball to center field. And Mays, on a dead run with his back to home plate, runs down that ball, somehow looks over his shoulder like a great wide receiver catching a football, but it's a lot different catching a much smaller baseball than it is a football. And it's not just that he makes this unbelievable catch on the dead run, 450 feet from home plate. It's what he does afterwards. He uses the momentum of the sprint, and most guys would tear knee ligaments doing this, but the momentum of the sprint put him in a position where he was able to make a quick stop and turn around and make a throw to keep Larry Doby from scoring. Now, he couldn't keep Larry Doby from getting from second base to third base, but if he doesn't make that throw back into the infield as instantaneously as he does because he was so far away, it's possible that Larry Doby scores, keeps it a 2-2 game, and the Giants win in extra innings, and they sweep the series. And that was that was the signature play, certainly, of that series, and the signature defensive play in the history of baseball. And he was such a smart player, such an instinctive player, such a student of the game that he said this. He said, as soon as it got hit, I knew I was going to catch the ball. All great athletes have confidence. He had confidence. The problem was Cleveland's Larry Doby on second base. Suppose I stop and turn and throw, and I get nothing on the ball. No momentum going on my throw, and Doby might have scored, giving his team the lead. To keep my momentum, to get it working for me, I have to turn very hard and short and throw the ball exactly to the point that I caught it. However, the only reason we celebrate this as much as we do is because we saw it. And that was in the World Series. Very few games were televised in 1954. Not everybody had a television in 1954. And that's preserved in history. Mays said might not even be in his top 10 of all-time catches. Just don't have any video or even still photo records of it. It was absolutely a remarkable play. And all these years later, 70 years later, I don't know if there's a defensive play in baseball that I've seen that's topped it. There may have been better plays. Mays may have had better plays. But no defensive play in baseball is celebrated like the catch, and that's all you have to say. Long before we started saying the catch about Dwight Clark, it was the Willie Mays catch of Vic Wertz in 1954. This is, and there's a lot of remarkable audio out there, and I'm going to play some of it as we go through the morning here, but this was something that they pulled up. I pulled up on YouTube, and it's incredible that this was their first meeting. Vin Scully, when he was, I think, 23 years old, joined the Brooklyn Dodgers broadcast booth in 1951, which was the same year that Willie Mays came up. Scully did games for 67 years. In his final year of doing the Dodger games, he was out. It must have been, because I don't even know if he traveled anymore. They must have brought Mays to Los Angeles, or he did make one short trip from L.A. to San Francisco. But Scully was doing the game, and they brought Mays up to the press box, and they met for the first time. They came into baseball together in 1951. This was 2016.
Vin Scully. I know. I mean, so many people. Come on over here, just so we can. Let me tell you something. I am. First of all, you've always been my favorite player, even though you wore the wrong uniform. You know that. But as I have told everybody, you've also been the greatest player I ever saw.
Thank you.
And I've said that for a long, long time.
Just to recap, because the audio isn't clear, but I wanted to play that. Here comes Willie Mays, and there's Vin Scully, and he goes, "Hi, Vin Scully." And Mays goes, "Oh, yeah, I know who you are." And then he says, "Not only were you my favorite player, you wore the wrong uniform." Little joke there. You know, the greatest rivalry in baseball might be Giants-Dodgers. But you were also the greatest player I ever saw. Now, he did Jackie Robinson. He did everybody. I mean, think of the players that Vin Scully broadcast over 67 years. Okay, he didn't see Babe Ruth. He may have seen him as a kid, didn't broadcast him, but said Willie Mays was not only his favorite player, but the greatest player he ever saw. Tim Kirkchin's a couple of years older than I am. And so he was from a baseball family. His father played, his brothers played. They were great players at Catholic University. And he was maybe indoctrinated into baseball a little earlier than I was. So he has recollections of Willie Mays playing as early as, he says, 1965, which was about 8 years before his career ended, and was still in his prime at that point. And he joined Scott Van Pelt last night, and I kvel a little bit about this as a graduate of BCC High School. Here's Scott Van Pelt from Sherwood High talking to Tim Kirkchin of Walter Johnson High School about a player that Scott's too young to have seen play, but Tim remembers seeing play and remembers interviewing him a number of times over the years. This was their conversation last night on SportsCenter.
This is a sport, Tim, that lends itself to heroes, whether we're kids or whether we're grown. And when you list your baseball heroes, where does it begin?
Well, it begins with Willie Mays. Willie Mays is, for me, the greatest player I've ever seen. And I was captivated by baseball at the earliest age. But when I saw Willie Mays lead off the 65 All-Star game on a color TV in our house, I just could not believe what I was watching. He was the greatest player. As Johnny Bench once put it, he was the perfect baseball player. He had the perfect build. He had a style to him that nobody else has ever had. I grew up 3,000 miles from San Francisco, and I worship Willie Mays. Every time he was on TV, which wasn't very often for me, I couldn't miss it. That's how great he was. And I'm telling you, Scott, when he broke in 1951, he was the greatest combination of power, speed, and defense that the game had ever seen. And here it is, 73 years later, and I believe with all my heart, he is still the greatest combination of power, speed, and defense that the game has ever seen. That's how great Willie Mays was.
It strikes me, Tim, and you mentioned it about the television. I jotted this down earlier, that so many of the pictures and the images are in black and white, but he played in such vivid Technicolor, didn't he? Just whether it was the combination of the aesthetic and the technical brilliance, it feels like that's perhaps uniquely his, isn't it?
It is. And again, that 65 All-Star game that I'm talking about was the first game that we ever watched on a color television in our house. And it was just breathtaking to watch him come out to the line for the pregame introductions and then to stand in the box and hit a home run like that. I cannot even begin to tell you how many people from that era felt that Willie Mays was their hero. And this many years later, he still is. And Scott, of all the things about him that amazed me, and I met him and interviewed him many times, he had the biggest, strongest hands I have ever seen. Dwayne Kuiper, who does the Giants games on TV, and of course a former major leaguer, he told me once that his dad, Dwayne's dad, always said, you have to win a handshake when you shake someone's hand. But you couldn't with Willie Mays. That's how big his hands were. And Pete Rose once told me, he said, I'm as big as Willie Mays. That's what Pete Rose said as far as size goes. And he hit 660 homers, and I hit 160 homers. That's how strong Willie Mays was. And that combination of power and speed and grace and base running, trust me, there has never been a baseball player like Willie Mays.
Leo DeRocher, his manager with the Giants, in his book said, and I'll quote, "If somebody came up and hit 450, stole 100 bases, and performed a miracle in the field every day, I'd still look you right in the eye and tell you that Willie was better." He inspired that level of awe from his peers and those whose job it was to manage. And I think that's really instructive, isn't it, Tim?
It is. I once asked Frank Robinson, one of the greatest players of all time, I said to Frank, "Is Willie Mays the greatest player you've ever seen?" And Frank rolled his eyes, typical Frank, looked at me and said, "Of course he is. Who else could there be?" That's how great Willie Mays was to all of his peers. Scott, he's the only player in Major League history to have a 300 average, 300 home runs, and 10 Gold Gloves. Keep in mind, he hit 302 with 660 homers and 12 Gold Gloves, and he led the league in steals 3 years in a row. He is the greatest defensive center fielder of all time, and you might make a case he's the greatest defensive player at any position of all time. And when he robbed Vic Wertz of the home run in the 54 series, Bob Feller once told me, "We knew he was going to catch that ball." Some people think it's the greatest catch of all time. We knew he was going to catch it. And Willie told me once, "That's not even one of the top 10 catches that I ever made." And some people call it the greatest catch in Major League history. That's how great he was.
Whether it's the numbers, the stories, or the memories that the man elicits from those like you, Tim, that saw him, I just feel that those of you that got to truly see him and appreciate him saw won't ever come this way again, will it?
No, and again, Scott, I'm 67 years old, and the only thing I got going for me still is that I am really old, and I got to see Willie Mays play in his prime. So anyone who wants to talk about today's players who are bigger, stronger, faster, and better than ever, they really have to go back to 1951 or the mid-60s to recognize what a transcendent talent he was. Reggie Jackson compared him to, of course, Michael Jordan and Jim Brown and Baryshnikov and Steph Curry shooting before a game. That's who he compared Willie Mays to. He's a combination of all of those. That's why most people consider him the greatest player they've ever seen, and you can count me in on that, and I'm not even sure there's a close second.
No, I don't think so either. Henry Aaron was a great, great player, I believe, still owns the clean home run record. And, you know, there's some irony, too, and when you talk about the greatest living ball player, we used to debate Aaron and Mays a few years ago when Henry Aaron was still alive. Now they're both gone. It would be an automatic that it would be Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds, the most home runs in history, was an all-star just about every year, had a great, great batting eye, always led the league in walks, excuse me, and a pretty good outfielder as well. But the steroids take care of it, and he was Willie Mays' godson. And when Willie Mays was in attendance to watch him break the record, so was Bud Selig, and Bud Selig kept his hands in his pants. He was good friends with Henry Aaron, and he knew it was a tainted record. But Mays came out on the field and gave his godson, a hug. And, you know, because of the tainted era and the tainted evidence, he never theoretically failed a drug test, though he admitted that he had used a steroid and didn't know what he was using, some kind of a cream or something like that. But, you know, the eye test tells you that he just, you know, blew up in size, and a guy who had never hit 50 home runs all of a sudden hit 73. There's a problem there. But, you know, that's the irony of this, that we would now look at who's the greatest living player. I think there's an argument to be made for Ken Griffey Jr. There may be a couple of others that I'm missing along the way. But until yesterday, Willie Mays was the greatest living player, and that even probably goes back to when Joe DiMaggio used to insist on being called the greatest living player. Willie Mays never played an official game in Washington, D.C., but he was here for 2 games, and one of them I was in attendance at, so I'll have memories of that. Plus, David Israel, who was a great columnist in his day and had a run at the Washington Star before he transitioned into becoming a very successful movie producer. He wrote a tribute on Facebook to Willie Mays and players of that era that I want to get to as well. Lots more to talk about with Mays. This is a day to remember the greatest player who I saw, maybe the greatest player in the history of the oldest game, the game of baseball, Willie Mays. Stay with us. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
We got a Tony show coming up at 11 o'clock today, and I am really looking forward to this. Tony is old enough to have seen Willie Mays play for the New York Giants. He said he was a Giant fan growing up. Willie Mays was his idol. He actually got to cover him when Mays played for the Giants, and certainly when he played for the Mets when Tony was a young sports writer in New York. And I think he will have some incredible things to say about Mays coming up at 11 o'clock. I'm going through what others are saying about him and giving you my own memories. I was told during the break that Buster Olney has suggested that the Major League logo, which started in 1969 when baseball started or had its 100th anniversary. It's pretty blah. It's a batter with a bat on his shoulder. It's nothing exciting. It's not as good as the Jerry West logo for the NBA. But Buster Olney said, let's put the picture of Mays with his back to the plate, number 24, catching the ball over his shoulder as the logo. That's a great idea. I would hope they do that. Rob Manfred, you never know what he's going to do. I think he's been a pretty weak commissioner, but okay, it's in your court. Let's see what happens with that. Before I get to what happened here in 1969 with Willie Mays, where the one time I got to see him in person, David Israel, who again was a great columnist, wrote for the Star, it was either the Chicago Tribune or one of the Chicago papers. Wilbon, who's my age, read him in high school as well, and someone I'm Facebook friends with, and he's had his cover photo of Willie Mays making that catch as long as I've been a Facebook friend of his for 7 or 8 years now, and he wrote this, and it's well written from somebody who has not been a sports writer for a long time. David Israel writing, "The man in the photo, the only number 24, the greatest baseball player I've ever seen, has died. Jackie's heirs are all gone now. They were the men who made Jackie's promise a reality and America a better country. They came from the Jim Crow South, playing games in which only the ball was white, and fought small, meaningful battles against America's original sin with every swing of the bat, every ball gathered on the warning track, every impossible dash from first to third on a sharply hit single. They were my childhood heroes. Starting with Willie, they made me a better, more enlightened man. As an adult, because of my work, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to let them know that in their time. My starting outfield on Forever's team is now complete. Willie Mays has taken his place in center field, flanked by Henry Aaron in right and Frank Robinson in left. Their work is done. It is our duty to carry on. Addendum. There is something you need to understand about Mays, Aaron, Frank Robinson, and a few other young black Americans like Ernie Banks and Bob Gibson who debuted in the 1950s. This was before Martin Luther King marched, before Rosa Parks sat, before John Lewis stood his ground. This was before the civil rights movement had a name. This was when water fountains, schools, and even major league ballparks were segregated. Much of America wanted them to fail, but failure was not an option. After Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Roy Campanella made mid-career transitions to the big leagues, Willie, Henry, and Frank were the first generation to get an opportunity to play full careers in the major leagues. It was incumbent upon them to make sure they weren't the last. That's pressure. They met it with grace. That's great writing about an incredible subject. And in reading the obit this morning about Willie Mays in the Post, and it was written by Paul Dugan, I didn't realize this, but when Willie Mays came up with the Giants in May of 1951, he was only the 17th black player in the major leagues. This was a full 4 years after Jackie Robinson had broken the color line. You can't tell me that the players were still active in the Negro Leagues, and I think the Negro Leagues stayed around even until like the early 1950s. You can't tell me that there weren't more players that were good enough to play in the majors. But he was a phenom. So much so, we talk about like LeBron James going right from high school to the NBA. Moses Malone was kind of the trailblazer in that 50 years ago when he left Maryland before playing a game and signed in the ABA. Willie Mays was playing professional baseball in the Negro Leagues when he was 16 freaking years old. He gave up his high school eligibility to play against men who would become professional players when they finally broke the color line, and a few of them became Hall of Famers. And his dad, who was playing on the same team, his dad said, yeah, he can play with us, but he can only play home games when school is going on. Until school lets out, he can't play road games. Imagine that. And he was discovered and brought up to the New York Giants. And this is before the draft. The draft didn't start until 1965. So you could sign anybody you wanted, and that's when scouts were of great value, and they discovered this kid. I mean, nowadays, this would be a front page of a USA Today story if in fact, something like the Negro League still existed. Hey, there's a 16-year-old kid who's starting on and I think the Birmingham Black Barons won the championship. And he was a good player on a great team, and he finally got his shot in the major leagues and came up with the New York Giants May 25th, 1951. Hitless in his first 12 at-bats on the road. First appearance at the Polo Grounds. He recorded his first hit, a home run. But he still was struggling, 1 for 26, and he was crying and saying to his manager, Leo DeRocher, and men from the South understand this, he called him Mr. Leo. That's how he was addressed, because that's a very Southern thing to do. And he said, please send me back to Minneapolis, to the minor leagues. And Leo said, son, you're my center fielder. And that was that. And he went on to hit 20 home runs that year. Hit a home run off Warren Spahn and hit 274 and was Rookie of the Year in 1951. And, in 1951, if you were a center fielder on a New York team, that's the equivalent now of being in the Patrick Mahomes discussion. It's hard to imagine that. Now, there were, quarterbacks of note at that point. Johnny Unitas hadn't come along yet, but there had been some great quarterbacks like Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman in the past, but it wasn't anything like it was today. So if you played center field for a New York team, you were the S there, and the song Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, Willie Mays, center field, New York Giants, Mickey Mantle, center field, New York Yankees, both came up the same year, and Duke Snyder, the Duke of Flatbush, playing center field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they were the most celebrated athletes in the world, and they all played in the same city. and more often than not, one of the three teams, if not two of them, were in the World Series every year. So they were in the center of the baseball universe, playing the most important position in sports in those days. The NBA was in its infancy. The NBA started late 1940s. You hadn't had guys like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain come along yet. Maybe George Mikan was known in Minneapolis, but not that far outside of it. And this was it. This was the position to play in the city, to play it in. And Mays and Mantle became enormous stars. Mantle, even more so, because people saw him play. They were in the World Series every year. The Giants didn't make it all the time. They made it a few times. But Mantle was, and the names too. I mean, guys don't have names like that. You don't hear names in sports. Mickey and Willie. Nobody's called that anymore. Maybe if they came along today, they would be called, although Mickey's real name is Mickey, maybe they would be known as, think about this, Michael Mantle. Does that work for you? William Mays. Does that work? Bill Mays? No. It just rolled off your tongue. It sounded like center fielders, Willie and Mickey. and then the Duke Snyder. Those were the romantic names of the times. And to think that they were able to do as much as they did and to star as much as they did, all three of them becoming Hall of Famers, and deservedly so. It all happened there, and I just look at that and just marvel at it. Now, by the time I was able to see Willie Mays, he was in the late stages of his career, and as I mentioned, there were 2 times that he played in Washington, not regular season games, but you've probably heard this a number of times today. He played 22 years in the big leagues and in 24 All-Star games. How is that possible? Well, for 4 years, they had 2 All-Star games. It was because it was money for the players, and so the players wanted to have it, and they would have, like, for example, I believe in 1962, they had a game here at newly opened D.C. Stadium. It was the first year that the Senators played here, 1962. It opened for football in 61 and for baseball in 62. And then they played like on a Tuesday night, hopped on the plane, flew to Chicago, and played the second one at Wrigley Field. Yeah, and that was extra money for the players. By the time he was here for the second time, it was just 1 All-Star game, and it was in Washington because it was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of baseball, 1969. And when you look at, and this is the remarkable thing, when you look at the box score from that game, these are the guys who were not in the starting lineup for the National League. Ernie Banks, Tony Perez, Pete Rose, okay, some of them were pitchers, Bob Gibson, Phil Niekro, Tom Seaver, Roberto Clemente, Steve Carlton did start, Ron Santo did start, Hank Aaron did start, Willie McCovey started, Johnny Bench started. Willie Mays did not. No, Willie Mays did not start in center field. Now, he was 38 years old, but he still hit 283 that year with 13 home runs in only 117 games. Maybe he was injured coming into the game and didn't want to, tweak anything or hurt himself further. But Matty Alou started in center field for the National League. And this was the last game, and maybe the last game ever, that was played in the afternoon. If you remember this, there was a huge amount of rain that fell that night, flooded the dugouts. It was supposed to be a Tuesday night. And they had to postpone the game until 1 o'clock the following day. And my dad was great. He took off work the next day. We went out. We went in the rain. We sat in our seats. I remember seeing Willie Mays warming up in the outfield Tuesday night before the game was called. And you got to remember this. This is a period of time where very few the games are on television. He's never played a regular season game, not even in Baltimore, because that's an American League city as well. And we had a black and white TV. We didn't get a color TV until just before the Redskins played in the Super Bowl in '73. So the only thing I have seen of Willie Mays is it may be a black and white TV shots of him playing in a game. So I see him in the flesh, and this is a big deal. It's hard to imagine this now, where we see these guys constantly on video or on your phone or, with interleague play, and it's not even interleague play anymore because every team plays every other team. You're going to probably get a chance to see a superstar play in person, but to see him in the flesh was amazing. Now, he did not start in this blowout game. It was a 9-2 game. The National League won, and Mays only pinch hit, and he flew out to the outfield and was maybe hit to the warning track, and that was it. He also played here in 1962 when they had the first All-Star game here. He started in that game but went 0 for 3 with a walk, did steal a base. Maury Wills, who was from Washington, played at Cardozo High School. He was the MVP of the game, but he came in as a pinch hitter in the late stages and had a hit and then stole a base and scored a run, and I think later walked and also scored a run. So he scored 2 runs in a 3-run game, 3-1 win for the National League. He was the MVP. But Willie Mays, in 2 All-Star games here in Washington, was hitless with a walk and a stolen base. And that was that. But in terms of what he did in the rest of his career, just absolutely remarkable. He finished up in New York with the Mets, and this was more like a gift to him. And again, the time that he lived in, and there's video of this, film of this, thank goodness. But Willie Mays, who in 1951 was the biggest star in New York, Well, I mean, maybe you could argue it was Mantle or DiMaggio was still active then, but he was a star and emerging as the Rookie of the Year. He lived in a rooming house in Harlem. I mean, and it's New York. It's not segregated, but he was making like $4,000. He lived in a rooming house, and when he wasn't playing baseball, he loved the game so much he played stickball in the streets with the kids. That's the joy that he brought to the game, in addition to the greatest set of skills of anybody who played it. Babe Ruth hit more home runs, and Babe Ruth was also a great left-handed pitcher. But he couldn't play the outfield like Mays. He couldn't throw like Mays. He certainly couldn't run like Mays. And he couldn't do all the different aspects of the game as well as Mays. Power, yes. Pitching, Mays didn't pitch. But everything that Mays had to do as a baseball player, he probably did it better than anybody else or as well as anyone else. You could put it that way. And just to think that his career is, kind of forgotten because he retired 50 years ago. And there's another thing about this, and this ties into what I'm about to talk about in the move to the Mets. His career was fading in San Francisco. He remained beloved in New York. Remember, Giants left New York after the 1957 season. So it's now 1972. It's 15 years later. He's played almost his entire career in San Francisco. And they still love him in New York. And so the Mets want him back. And they make a trade for him. He's 41 years old. And in his first game as a Met, he hits a home run, and the Mets win the game. That's the kind of drama that he could bring and excitement. He, was at that point not a great hitter anymore, not a great player, but he was still playing for the Mets and was a player when they went to the World Series in his last year in 1973. Now, he did lose a ball in the sun and fell down in the outfield. And that is often referenced as something that we compare fading athletes to. Oh, that's Willie Mays stumbling in the outfield. Well, it really wasn't fair because, yes, he did drop a ball in the outfield, and he did it on the biggest stage in the World Series. But he also had a hit later in the game, which helped the Mets win the game. Now, they lost in 7 to the Oakland A's. But, it's so sad that anybody would think of Willie Mays for only that he was a guy who hung around too long. He hung around because they wanted him to hang around. They loved him. And he's even though he didn't deliver a World Series for the Mets, he's beloved. He's beloved in New York and beloved as a Met, even though he only played a year and a half with them. And you just look at his life and what he was able to do as a kid born to a 16-year-old mother in poverty in Alabama at a time when blacks were not allowed in baseball, and to have put together one of the greatest careers, if not the greatest career in the history of the game, and 50 years after he had retired is beloved in this way. Just absolutely remarkable. Bob Costas speaks as eloquently as anybody about baseball and grew up in New York and grew up in the era of Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. He was friends with Willie Mays and was great friends with Mickey Mantle, even delivered a eulogy at his funeral. He did a feature several years ago when Mays was still alive for the MLB Network, and I'm going to play that at 10 o'clock. But we'll shift a little bit. And this is just off-season yap, really. But there's Brandon Aiyuk stuff going on with the Commanders because of a social media post that was put up involving Jayden Daniels. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. Adam Schefter weighing in on that yesterday. We'll get to that and more as we continue. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
We got Tony coming up at 11 o'clock, I'm sure, with many memories of Willie Mays, who he idolized as a kid, got to cover him as a sports writer. But this is some breaking news here. And you just got to shake your head at the amount of money that gets really wasted in professional sports. This is incredible. The Detroit Pistons, who must have had a tank plan. I mean, they couldn't have expected to be any good this year. And they had hired Monty Williams, who I thought had done a pretty good job in Phoenix. But, okay, they gave him a monster contract to come in and I thought rebuild the team. It was a 6-year deal. Monty Williams has been fired. You know what's left on his deal? 5 years, $65 million. $65 million. Yeah, I get another job and some of the money will be offset, but the Pistons are on the hook for most of that. He's not going to be a head coach, I don't think, next year, making $2-3 million as an assistant, whatever they make. 5 years, $65 million, and I don't know what happened here and why they waited so long to do it. They won only 14 games. They had a 28-game losing streak last season. They do have a new team president, Trajan Langdon. I mean, it would seem to me, though, if you're going to hire Trajan Langdon, one of the early questions you ask is, well, what about Monty Williams? And if he says, oh, he's got to go, you say, well, that's going to cost us $65 million if we do that. Well, if you want me, you got to get rid of him. So maybe that's the way it worked. And what has Trajan Langdon done? Has anybody confused Trajan Langdon with Red Auerbach recently? Not that I know of. Wow, this is crazy. This is just absolutely crazy. 6-year, $78.5 million deal with a 2-year team option that would put it at over $100 million. This is for an NBA coach. Coaches come and go in most cases. You know, the Greg Popoviches of the world are like needles in a haystack. They never happen. and they're going to eat that amount of money. That is just absolutely unbelievable. They won 14 games this year. How many was he expected to win? And if you're going to only win 14, what would have been the point of winning, say, 28? You know, you still would have been in the lottery and you wouldn't have the number 1 pick. Now, granted, it's a crappy draft and there ain't much to choose from there. But that's just unbelievable. And just for comparison here, not that Ted is the cheapest guy in the world, but as far as I know, going back to when Ted bought the Capitals in, I think, 98 or 99, I believe, or maybe it was the spring of 98 after they had made it to the Cup Finals, I don't think he's ever gotten rid of a coach with time left on his deal. It may be 1 year in some cases, but, you know, Ted doesn't like to pay dead money. The Pistons must love this. 5 years, $65 million. He lasted 1 year for a team in a total rebuild. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. All right, some NFL stuff. This surfaced the other day. It surfaced on TikTok. It was something that was put up by Brandon Aiyuk, who is a wide receiver with the San Francisco 49ers, one of the better ones in the league. He had like 75 catches. He had over 1,000 yards his last 2 years. He's in the discussion of top 6, 7, 8 receivers in the league. And part of the big reason that the 49ers have played in a couple of Super Bowls in recent years. But in doing this TikTok video, he was with Jayden Daniels, and you hear Aiyuk say, the 49ers don't want me, and you hear Daniels say, that's it? And he goes, yeah, that's it. And he goes, my man, indicating, you know, maybe he's going to come here. And because they played together, Daniels and Aiyuk, they played together for a year when Aiyuk was a senior at Arizona State, and Daniels was a freshman quarterback there, and they maintained a friendship. As a matter of fact, when Daniels came in, he said in getting advice for the NFL, he went to Aiyuk for that. So the speculation is running rampant in a dull period of time in sports. There's not a hell of a lot going on right now. So people are obsessing about the idea of Aiyuk coming here to the Commanders. They have the cap room to sign him to a long-term contract. He's due $14 million this year, which they can certainly fit in under their cap. But Adam Schefter was on yesterday on our morning show. He said, not so fast, my friend.
What is going on when Brandon Aiyuk is telling Jayden Daniels, the number 2 pick in the draft, that he doesn't want to be in San Francisco anymore? They don't want him there. So I thought that Jayden Daniels was playing quarterback for the Commanders and signed a big deal to play quarterback and be the face of that franchise. I didn't realize he's coming for our jobs as well with the news here with Brandon Aiyuk. So we start there. But then once we get beyond that point in time, look, the 49ers have made repeated efforts to sign Brandon Aiyuk. The two sides were unable to work out a deal. And now the problem that I think has entered into the situation, the scenario, is that some of these other wide receiver deals have gotten done at big numbers. We saw Jalen Waddle, I believe the number was $28 million. Justin Jefferson, the number is $35 million. if and when CD Lamb gets done, and if not close, it'll be over $30 million. So there are some big number deals that have been north of what the 49ers and Brandon Aiyuk were discussing. And so when the talks break down, now Brandon Aiyuk is saying that they don't want him back in a TikTok video. Well, they do want him back. They do want him back. But they don't want him back at the price that Brandon Aiyuk wants to be back at. That's really the issue there. So let's be very clear in defining what that means. No, they do want him back, and they've made repeated efforts to bring him back and made multiple offers to bring him back, but not at a price that tells him in today's wide receiver market that they want him back. And the price has gone up on wide receivers, and that's why the deal has not gotten done. And I don't believe there's been recent talks to get it done because now they've entered into a challenging situation here where the price has gone up, and he does have 1 year left on his deal. And the Niners did draft 2 wide receivers in the first 4 rounds, and they did re-sign Jawan Jennings and added a 1 year extension to his deal. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but the fact of the matter is Brandon Aiyuk is under contract with the 49ers for this season.
I would think that they're not going to deal him. They're looking to get back to the Super Bowl and win this year. And Brandon Aiyuk here, I don't know how Adam Peters looks at this, but if I were Adam Peters, this is what I would say. You got a team that's trying to get its footing. You finally got a quarterback for Terry McLaurin, who's played for 13 different guys over the time he's been here, and none of them have really worked out. So you finally got a guy who you hope can be that franchise quarterback, and they can do things together. Ayuk's going to come in as a 1, right? He's not going to come in here and say, I'm number 2 behind McLaurin. I don't think it's going to work that way. And you're going to have more pressure on a young quarterback in Jayden Daniels, as good as he is now and as good as he might become and as much maturity as he has. You don't want his good buddy in the huddle saying, hey, I'm open, man, get me the ball. And that's what receivers do. Terry McLaurin doesn't seem to operate that way, but Aiyuk does, and not that that's a bad thing. You want guys who want the ball. You want guys with confidence, but I think it puts a little bit too much pressure on a quarterback who's just trying to take over as the leader of this team. So I don't see it as a good fit here. I really don't. As good as he may be, and you'd like to be in a position someday where you can add a Brandon Aiyuk and hope to make a run look like the Patriots did when you take on Randy Moss, and they basically got him for nothing from the Raiders, who he was through with them. They were through with him. And, without the David Tyree helmet catch, that Patriot team goes undefeated and is the all-time team in the history of professional football. And Randy Moss, who was part of Tom Brady's incredible season where he threw 50 touchdown passes, that's celebrated as one of the greatest seasons ever with a certain, extra flair for a wide receiver, a Hall of Fame wide receiver in Randy Moss. That's not this. That's maybe down the line, that's a missing piece that you add. But I just don't see this as a good fit in any way to bring Brandon Aiyuk here. And I just don't see the 49ers, who are on the cusp. They lost in overtime to the greatest team of this era, a team that's won 3 of the last 4 Super Bowls. They took them to overtime. Don't you think that they think they can have another opportunity to get back to the Super Bowl this year and maybe win it? And losing a key piece like Aiyuk wouldn't help them. So I don't think it's going to happen, but it makes for good discussion in a period of time where we don't have any football. It's the period of time, by the way, is shorter than I thought. Commanders announced yesterday that they're opening training camp for rookies on July 18th. They're basically getting a month off. Their veterans don't have to come in until the 24th. But, it's a short off season in football. Coming up, we're on the great and wonderful career of Willie Mays. Stay with us. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630. Conversation today, and I just, I'm checking with people who are much younger than me. Mike Callow is here today in his 30s, and I asked him when you first became aware of Willie Mays, and you said it was synonymous with baseball. So your earliest memory of learning about baseball included Willie Mays, right?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, you put him up there with kind of like the Babe Ruth type names.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you early on as a child, you can't put the name to the face, but it's a name I just constantly heard people talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was when I was first learning about baseball. I went to my first game with my dad in 1966. So I was 7 going on 8. And I think I remember knowing about him for sure. And he was, at that point, he was very much in his prime then. He played until 1973. And so, we've had this long period of time since he stopped playing, which was 1973, but over 50 years. But there was a long period where Joe DiMaggio was still alive, and DiMaggio lived until 1999. And while he was a great, great player himself, he had to be referred to at old-timers games, insisted on it, as the greatest living player. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't see DiMaggio play. I'm too young for that. But, most people who had seen both careers, it's Willie Mays. And Mays never said anything about it, and to think the things that he was able to do. DiMaggio, I don't think, ran the bases like he did. He hit for better average, didn't strike out, didn't hit as many home runs, played great center field for the Yankees, no question, didn't have the arm. Willie had it all. He hit for power, he hit for average. There were stories of, if you caught a ball in the outfield, don't try and throw it in to hold him up on second base. Just let him take third on you, because if you try and hold him up at second, he's going to go home.
Yeah,
that's how incredible he was. That was in his prime. Now, I saw him late in his career, and I saw him play in the All-Star game, won at that. 1969, when he was at 38 years old, and then in his last appearance in the World Series in 1973 with the Mets, and people talk about him falling down in the outfield and all that. But I'll say this about Willie Mays, who died at the age of 93. He not only knew how to make an entrance, because he made his entrance as the golden age of baseball is dawning. New York baseball in the 1950s was it. That was it. And you had the greatest stars in the game, because you had no draft in those days. The Yankees were getting anybody they wanted. The Brooklyn Dodgers broke the color line with Jackie Robinson. He was the most exciting player in the game. And they had a great team, the Dodgers. The Yankees were always great. And the New York Giants, they were one of the early teams to bring on black players like Monty Irvin and later Willie Mays. And so they were in the mix almost every year. Now, Willie missed 2 really key years of his career. He was Rookie of the Year in 1951. Early in the 1952 season, I don't know whether he was drafted or how it worked, but he wound up in the Army, and he missed most of his, age 22 and 23 seasons, when theoretically he could have hit 40 home runs each year. He wound up with 660 for his career, so... what would he have had? 740? He would, and then we debate, maybe Aaron passes him to get to 755, but then you get into the whole debate with Bonds, and that's another part of the discussion now. If you are a Barry Bonds guy, you say he's the greatest living player, but if you are one who thinks he should be banned from the Hall of Fame, then you don't include him in the discussion.
Sure.
So it's interesting. But the entrance that he made was just at the right time, so you had that great Willie, Mickey, and the Duke time in the 50s, in the greatest city for baseball, in the greatest era. His exit is ironic, because in Birmingham, Alabama, where he grew up and played in the Negro Leagues when he was a teenager, they are honoring basically him. They're honoring the Negro Leagues, but him in particular, at Rickwood Field. And there's a game that's going to be played tomorrow night. It's the Giants are playing St. Louis, I believe. Yeah, St. Louis tomorrow night at that field. And they were, they are still going to honor Willie Mays for what he did. And he even had released a statement that was going to be read. He knew that he wasn't going to be able to make it. He had been pretty much housebound for the last year. But he put out this statement. He said, "I can't believe it. I never thought I'd see in my lifetime a Major League Baseball game being played on the very field where I played baseball as a teenager. It has been 75 years since I played for the Birmingham Black Barons at Rickwood Field, and to learn that my Giants and the Cardinals will play a game there and honor the legacy of the Negro Leagues and all those who came before them is really emotional for me. We can't forget what got us here and what the Negro Leagues meant for so many of us.
I'm not able to get to Birmingham this year, but we'll follow the game back here in the Bay Area. My heart will be with all of you who are honoring the Negro League players who should always be remembered, including all my teammates on the Black Barons. I want to thank Major League Baseball, the Giants, Cardinals, and the fans who will be at Rickwood or watching the game. It'll be a special day, and I hope the kids will enjoy it and be inspired by it. There's also this, and this was in USA Today from Bob Nightingale. If you know anything about Dusty Baker, he is like in part of every part of history of baseball. You know, he's on deck when Hank Aaron breaks Babe Ruth's record.
He's Forrest Gump.
Yeah, he's absolutely Forrest Gump. So, the last person to see Willie Mays alive?
No way.
Dusty Baker. Of course. Yeah. And so Dusty's now retired. He's 75 years old. In fact, he just turned 75. And he's in Birmingham for this game to help celebrate the Negro Leagues. And he says, isn't it ironic, he said, that while the eyes of the entire baseball world is on Birmingham, Willie passes. And he said he went to Mays' house on Monday before he went to Birmingham. And he was there with the Giants' longtime public address announcer, Reynold Brooks Moon. They were the last two people to see Mays alive. He says, there's just something that told me to go see him. My dad always used to tell me, if you're thinking of someone, don't put it off. You don't know whether you'll see him again. Well, I went to see him, and thank God I did. I mean, that's just incredible. You know, you talk about divine intervention. You can certainly make an argument for that. And so this will be a celebration of his life tomorrow, as well as the Negro Leagues and the game itself. They're going to unveil a mural of Mays. I guess. I don't know if it'll be the catch, but I understand Buster Olney has suggested that become the new logo. Major League Baseball. Okay. Makes sense. But the idea to have this was because of Willie Mays, because he had played at Rickwood Field, and then, of course, went on to this great career. This was something that was put together by Bob Costas several years ago for the MLB Network. It includes part of an interview that he did with Mays. Things that are produced for television don't always work as well for radio, but I thought this one worked. So this was a feature that Costas did on Mays and what he meant to the game of baseball.
He was one of the most colorful stars to ever play. But beyond his talent and style, there was Mays' feel for the game. Mays was always a fan favorite. He was one of the most colorful stars to ever play. But beyond his talent and style, there was Mays' feel for the game and his high baseball IQ.
People always used to talk about your sense of the game. Mm-hmm. How you would call pitches from center field. You'd position the infielders and the other outfielders. You just had a sense of the game.
The rule that we had when I played, this one hand, it go left or right. Anytime that hand move, you got to move. That's the only rule we ever had in the outfield. Now, if you didn't see that, you didn't play the next day. Very simple.
You had the power to bench a guy the next day, regardless of what Alvin Dark or Herman Franks or whoever was the manager said?
Mm-hmm. I ran the field, and I said to Herman, you run the bench, I'll run the field. I didn't have a coach when I played. I didn't have one. Everything I did was on my own.
Let's say you're on first, guy hits a double in the gap. Mm-hmm. You're rounding second base. Mm-hmm. The third base coach is looking at you. He doesn't do anything?
I don't look at him. That's not my problem. I look at the guy that got the ball. If the ball is in the gap and the guy having to bobble it, I'm the scorer.
Mays' baseball instincts were almost always right. Almost always. Just ask Willie about his friend, the late Ken Boyer, the Cardinals' MVP third baseman.
I hit a triple, and we're playing in San Francisco, and he came over to me, and he says, step off the bag, Willie, and let me, straighten it out. Fool like me stepped off the bag, and he tagged me out. Yeah.
Willie Mays got caught by the hidden ball trick?
I did, and I cussed him all kinds. I called him all kinds of names. That's what happened. He's such a good friend of mine. I didn't think he would ever lie to me,
In a golden era of baseball greats, Willie Mays was the biggest star of all. There were the great catches, like Game 1 of the '54 World Series at the Polo Grounds. Cleveland's Vic Wirtz at the plate.
There's a long drive way back in center field, way back, it is
And this one on a Saturday game of the week late in his career when Mays jumped over Bobby Bonds to make this catch. But it wasn't just the catches or the daring base running or even the 660 home runs that separated Mays from the others. It was playing stickball with the neighborhood kids in the New York streets before a game. It was the energy and enthusiasm which he seemed to bring to every inning. The fans loved the show, and Willie knew it.
Were you always mindful of the idea that, yeah, you want to win the game, but you also want to entertain people?
If a fly ball was coming up, and I know I got this ball without any problem, if you slip, the first thing people going to holler, ooh, ow, all that kind of jump. And
so you'd slip on purpose?
Oh, yeah, you just do that.
Would you get a cap? They always said you get a cap that wasn't really the right size, so it would fly off.
Somebody told you that.
Yeah.
When I'm running, if I did this, the cap is on the ground all the time. You have to entertain people, and that's what I want to do all the time.
Whether it was the flying cap, his trademark basket catch, or some other facet of his unique style, Mays' appeal went beyond hardcore baseball fans. On a team of stars, he was always the big attraction when the Giants came to town. And in the 1960s, he even had a short television career.
I remember as a kid, you would show up on some of these television shows, and it didn't make any sense, but all of a sudden, there'd be Willie Mays like at Donna Reed's house.
Yeah.
What was up with that?
When I needed money, I'm telling you, see, you guys are laughing. This is the way I made money. When I needed money, there was an owner. His name was Tony Owen. Was Donna Reed's husband, but he was the producer of the show, like this kind of show.
Right.
So I said to Tony, I need to make $10,000, man. He said, I can't give you $10,000. He said, but I tell you what I'm gonna do. You come on here for like a half a minute or 2 minutes, we'll give you $10,000. I said, you got it.
Donna.
Willie, what a nice surprise.
So I learned every year that I needed 10 or 15,000, call up Tony. I got the money without any problem.
So you cast yourself on these shows?
Oh, yeah.
And here he is. Hi, Donna. Hi, Alex. Hope I'm not bothering you folks. Hi, Willie.
Come on in.
If you somehow missed his brilliant TV work, you could have turned on your radio to hear Willie celebrated in song.
Say hey.
Yeah, the say hey thing goes back to when he first came up and he couldn't remember anybody's name. So when he wanted their attention, he'd just say hey. And so one of the sports writers, hey, that's the say hey kid. And that's when nicknames were popular. You know, one of the things, too, about the connection to New York and San Francisco, there are some shots of him later in life, well after he retired and became sort of an ambassador for the Giants. He's always wearing a baseball hat. But if you notice, the hat has a G on it. I think he went out of his way not to differentiate between the New York Giants and the San Francisco Giants, even though he spent most of his career in San Francisco. There are some pictures I've seen him with an SF up there, but it seemed like he was more interested in the whole Giant franchise and the glory days. Not that there weren't glory days in San Francisco, because he was a great player there and the great rivalry they had with the Dodgers, but the one World Series he won was with the New York Giants, and that's where he first burst on the scene, and that's where, you know, sort of his legend was carved in an era where he was living in a rooming house in Harlem. You know, a big star living in a rooming house and playing stickball with the kids in the street. And the story he's telling there at the end of this Costas feature that was put together about showing up on the Donna Reed show or other sitcoms whenever he wanted to get $10,000. I mean, think of it now. He was as big a star then as LeBron James is now. LeBron, who makes, what does he make? He makes 900 million or something. I don't know. He's like a billionaire, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that includes his endorsements. He gets a Supermax deal pretty much forever, and then Nike and, you know, all the endorsements that he does. Yeah.
But to think that LeBron would, you know, go online and check his checking account. Oh, it's a little low. Let me call my buddy
Don't think so.
You know, and see if I can do a walk-on. Do they even have sitcoms anymore or whatever, you know, whatever's popular now, and I just get a walk-on for $10,000. But that's the money. Now, he was making. At one time, he was the highest paid player in the game at like $165,000, which was a lot of money in those days. But even in relative dollars now, we're talking to the time maybe $1 million something. Now these guys are making, Shohei's making $70 million a year, and he was, and you talk about the period of time. This is San Francisco. This is not the Deep South. He tried to buy a house in a neighborhood, and they wouldn't let him buy it there because of his color. And it's pointed out in the obit in the Post that while he did idolize Jackie Robinson, he did not participate in any of the civil rights things. That just wasn't his way. And he said, people do things in different ways. I would say this, because he became such a hero to so many people, black and white, and that maybe he did help to advance the civil rights movement in that way. He wasn't one who was participating in marches and things that Jackie Robinson was involved with, and Jackie was critical of him late in life when he wrote his biography. But I just think that it's so unusual where we talk about someone who hasn't played baseball in 50 years that if he walked onto the game now in his prime, he would be the best player. And I don't know if, Michael Jordan in his prime maybe could do that, but he's only been out of the NBA for 20, 22, 23 years. This is a man who'd been out for 50, and the game has changed, but it hadn't changed enough where his skills wouldn't still be of absolutely incredible value. So that's amazing.